Hi, everybody. It's Eric Murray from the sugarhuddle.com. Yesterday, it was late yesterday and technically early morning on the East Coast. I actually did a fantasy football preview article. Throughout the regular season, I'll probably try to write something fantasy wise, maybe once or twice a week. But anyways, I figured, a lot of people's drafts are this weekend, other people next weekend. So I figured I might as well just kind of put my 2 cents in for what it's worth, and just kind of give a little bit of advice and just kind of general thoughts and opinions regarding, fantasy football this year. So, again, for what it's worth, kind of take it for a grain of salt, I guess. But, I've won fantasy leagues before, so I'm not terrible or nothing. But, anyways, make sure you go to sugarhuddle.com and check out all my articles and subscribe to my YouTube channel. But anyways, yeah, let's get into it. So, every year it seems like you hear kind of the same fantasy advice and suggestions from a lot of the major media outlets and from like a lot of the fantasy football experts out there. And, usually that advice is typically, you want to go running back first. Really try to avoid a quarterback in the first round if you can. Maybe wait a few rounds for a QB. Draft a kicker last, and obviously you don't want, obviously you're not going to draft a backup kicker. Draft defense next to last, and not have a backup defense. One thing, though, I thought was a little bit interesting this year that I've been seeing is it's been recommended to not draft a backup tight end, to just have carry one tight end on your roster, and I actually think that is good advice. One thing, and this is just kind of speaking in general terms, even beyond fantasy, just football in general. It seems like in the NFL, tight end and safety are kind of intertwined because historically, you see a lot of times safeties will have to cover tight ends, especially down the seams and things like that. Although more and more with linebackers, you see a lot of those guys, the athletic guys that are able, that are able to run with tight ends. But historically, it seems like when you talk about like the free agent market and you talk about the draft, it seems like when one's down, the other goes down, and one's red hot, the other's red hot. Like think about like the early to mid 2000s, all of a sudden, the popularity in safety really exploded with guys like Paul Malu and Ed Reed. And then, all of a sudden you had a lot of safeties that were starting to go in the top 10 of the draft. You started seeing a number of safeties that were getting big money in free agency. And around that same time, you also saw the tight end position explode. You already kind of had a couple of former basketball playing, really athletic tight ends in the NFL, mainly Tony Gonzalez, who came in, I think his rookie year was 97. But then all of a sudden, like in mid 2000, you had Antonio Gates, and then Witten and Heath Miller and a number of other guys came in. Then you had high draft picks, Kellen Winslow, Vernon Davis, and so those positions remain red hot for a number of years. But recently both are kind of down, and we saw this past offseason in free agency, the safety market was really, really down, and the money was really, really low. There's some good bargains out there. And the talk was that, with the high demand for the lockdown cornerbacks and all the money that the corners are getting to do what they do and kind of take away half the field, there's not as much of an emphasis down the seams. And then as far as even down the seams and things like that, with a lot of these undersized linebackers that are so fast that can kind of cover almost anybody, that are basically kind of like hybrid safeties. Think about like Deion Jones from the Falcons and guys like that. It just really kind of devalued the safety position. And then on the flip side, with tight end, and again, this is just speaking in general terms, there's such an offensive lineman shortage in this league, and a lot of that's because of the spread offenses in college and the lack of physicality and the lack of complexity with those offenses and the plays and things like that. And so, teams are really overpaying for linemen to get all the help they need. And the problem is tight ends, used to be so versatile that they could catch 50, 60, 70 plus passes a year and also be excellent inline blockers. Well, a lot of them are basically just glorified, oversized receivers that can't block worth a lick. And that's how they're used a lot of times in college as well. So, you look at that, you look at the fact that besides the obvious, where there's always going to be a big emphasis on, the number one receiver and having that big number one receiver, and also having a good number two guy, there's also more of an emphasis lately on a lot of the slot guys, whether it's the home run threat slot type guys. Those offensive weapons that are a little bit like a running back too. With like a Tyreek Hill, or more of the possession type slot guys like we see in New England and places like that. And so that, and then also running back wise, I mean, running backs are making a big comeback. You're starting to see some running backs get paid really, really big, crazy money, like Todd Gurley recently. And so, trying to find a running back that all of a sudden can be an every down guy again, rather than the by committee stuff, to get the 300 plus carry a year running back that can also catch 50 or 100 passes. All those things are really taking away from the tight end position. So as far as fantasy goes, the running back resurgence, and running backs are obviously going to always go way ahead of the tight ends anyways in fantasy, but that and some of these slot guys that are emerging, those kind of things are really kind of affecting the tight ends. And really there's more NFL teams that are kind of experimenting with almost like spread type offenses. And the problem is in college, there's a lot of spread offenses that don't really put a big emphasis on their tight ends, even when they have really talented guys. They're kind of underused. And you see some of that with certain NFL teams too, that sometimes don't always get as aggressive as they need to be with some of their tight end play, especially if they have pretty good athletic pass catcher. So just kind of to make a long story short, just kind of go with one tight end. Guy I would stay away from is Gronk, because Rob Gronkowski, you just don't know how many games he's going to miss on a given year. We know he's so productive when he's healthy, but that's a big if, especially a year like this where New England, has missing a lot of guys. Gronk would be really great, and that's why a lot of people still have him as like the number one guy in fantasy. But again, if he's only playing 10 or 11 games, then that's not really going to help you, especially if he's not available for fantasy playoffs. So you have to be very, very wary of drafting him, especially if you're going to presumably only draft one tight end. So I would kind of stay away from him. I got this draft guide with me to kind of refer to things because I'm going to throw out so many names. Obviously Travis Kelce. I'd be a little bit concerned about drafting him just because with Pat Mahomes in there, you have to think about, is Pat Mahomes going to really try to chuck it deep a lot, and who knows how he's going to do as far as the intermediate passing. Didn't really have to throw to tight ends when he was in college at Texas Tech. Zach Ertz for the Eagles, he's up there. If Nick Foles does have to start the first few weeks and he plays pretty well, then Ertz wouldn't be a bad option. I really like Evan Ingram, though. Evan Ingram for the Giants. I don't really care for Eli, but I think when you think about the fact that Odell Beckham Jr. is presumably going to be healthy all year, and the same with Sterling Shepard, much, much better offensive line, which definitely helps out Eli. And then, of course, Saquon Barkley, the rookie running back. I think Evan Ingram could be a pretty good-looking player in fantasy. So that's a guy that I would keep a pretty close eye on. As far as kind of a little bit of a sleeper, and I didn't actually mention him at all in my article on the sugarhuddle.com, but O.J. Howard from the Bucs, he might be an interesting one. They still have Cameron Brate, who's a pretty decent player, but O.J. Howard, I heard, is really wowing in camp right now, so that's kind of a name I just wanted to throw out there a little bit. But as far as I might as well kind of break it down by teams. As far as the Giants go, you look at Saquon Barkley, he's going to be a guy that a lot of people are talking about as a first-round fantasy running back. I would probably wait till the end of the first round if you happen to have a late first-round pick, just because, he hasn't proven himself yet in the NFL. You can only take so much from training camp and everything. So I want to see what he does at the NFL level first, and so maybe next year, maybe he's in the running as a number one overall pick. But, rookie running backs, you have to be a little bit careful taking that guy too high. So again, if you take a chance at the end of the first round, not that big of a deal. But, I think when you look at all the other options, when you look at Todd Gurley, Le'Veon Bell, Alvin Kamara is the guy that I'm going to get into a little bit here. A number of other guys. It just seems like there's probably 7 or 8 guys that maybe would be better options just because they're at least a little bit proven in this league. But then again, when you look at what Ezekiel Elliott did a couple years ago as a rookie, and then you look at what Kareem Hunt did last year with Kansas City, then I can understand, too, why maybe you would consider him as the number 1 or 2 or 3 overall pick in your fantasy draft. But again, I'd rather just kind of wait till the end of the first round. Call me conservative, but I would just rather wait on a rookie player, for what it's worth. But anyways, when you look at running backs, while we're on the subject, Todd Gurley is pretty much going to be most people's number one. Again, Le'Veon Bell's going to be right there, and Ezekiel Elliott's going to be right there, a couple other guys. But I think the way the Rams have continued to bolster their offense, they just re-signed right tackle Rob Havenstein, however you pronounce it. Pretty good bookend. Adding Brandon Cooks via trade, home run hitting slot type guy, had a career year in New England last year, and I think he'll have a pretty good year with the Rams. Those things will take a lot of pressure off of Gurley, really help Gurley. So I think he's probably going to be the number one fantasy guy like he's projected to be. He was something crazy, like 37% of the Rams' offense last year, somewhere around there. So, I mean, he's just such a huge focal point, and it's kind of more understandable why they gave him such a crazy contract. So, yeah, I would feel pretty good about Gurley as the number one overall pick. Again, injuries happen, but I would feel pretty good about Gurley. He'll get his 300-plus carries, and he'll catch a whole truckload of passes, maybe even upwards of 100. So, I know there's some people talking about certain guys in this league who could be 1,000 players, 1,000 rushing yards, 1,000 receiving yards in a season. It has happened before. But, Gurley could legitimately do it this year, even with all the other, weapons that they have in L.A. So that's something to keep an eye on. Le'Veon Bell, though, I'm a little bit timid on because, obviously this is the second year in a row that he got franchise tagged. And like last year, he's waiting till the end of the camp before he signs his tag, then he'll join the team. And, with his track record of a number of injuries, mainly nagging injuries, I'm just concerned that maybe he does get nicked up this year. Remember, the Steelers are going to try to run him into the ground. He's had 350, 400-plus touches the last couple of years. And the Steelers, because they know that they're probably not going to franchise him for a third and final time next year, that he's, they couldn't come to a contract agreement this offseason, and he's pretty much going to walk after this year. I think, the Steelers are they're just going to give him the ball all the time if they can. But at the same time, because of some of his injury history, I think that is, something to factor in, that they might give him the ball a lot early on. He might be the number one fantasy running back for half the year, and then he might get banged up for 2 or 3 games, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, so much for that. And then also the fact that Pittsburgh has such a powerful offense, and, even with Todd Haley gone now, the offensive coordinator, they're still, they still hired from within, and they're still going to probably get pretty aggressive with the passing game when you have Antonio Brown and Juju Smith-Schuster, who I'll get to in a little bit. And the Steelers have shown in recent years that, they're not all about running. They're not all about, trying to be conservative. They get pretty aggressive with the passing game. They're not afraid to pull the trigger. So that could be something, too, that they could abandon the run at any point if they're having, a few off days. So that could hurt Bell's production as well. And again, as long as Antonio Brown keeps doing his thing, and if Juju keeps improving from last year, who knows, maybe that could hurt Bell a little bit. So I'm not super high on Le'Veon Bell, and then you wonder, how motivated is he going to be, because he's just playing under a franchise tag, not a huge contract. But then again, he's playing for a big contract somewhere else. So it's like, I don't know. I'm a little bit back and forth on him. Ezekiel Elliott, my one concern is, his line got banged up a little bit in camp so far. Zach Martin, fortunately for him, he didn't have any sort of season-ending injury last week against the Bengals, so he's right back in action. Travis Frederick, he was having a number of neck stingers, and it turned out he had this rare autoimmune disease. Yesterday I'd read that it sounded like he was pretty much going to be back right away. So that's what I put in my article. Then I read today, it sounds like he might be out indefinitely. So I really don't know, if he'll be there by week 1 or the first few weeks of the season, or what's going to happen. But if he is, and Martin's still there, then, I think Elliott's a pretty good pick. He's not going to have to worry about any kind of suspension this year unless he does something to get himself suspended. One concern, though, I would have is not real crazy about Dak Prescott. We know he took a step back last year, and even with Zeke, even though their record was better, I think they were like 5-3, 5-4 before Zeke served his suspension, somewhere around there. But Dak, I don't know. I just think he's a mediocre quarterback. They didn't really improve the wide receiver position hardly at all this offseason. So even though Dez won't be there to be a problem, you remember you also lost Jason Witten. And you don't really have a true number one. You might not even have a true number two receiver right now. Rookie Michael Gallup is trying to kind of prove himself, and he's looked pretty decent from what I've heard. But nonetheless, you just don't know what you're going to get out of Dak. If his production is closer to last year than his rookie year, then that will hurt Zeke because teams will start loading up the box more. But the Cowboys have also shown that they can overcome that and still rush for a lot of yards. So at the end of the day, I think I would take a chance on Zeke early in a fantasy draft and, within the first 3 to 5 picks or whatever. Probably not number one overall, but definitely second or third. I could definitely see that. And then, there's a trio guy that I mentioned Barkley already. But there's a few other guys I wanted to mention here, and I wrote them down. Kareem Hunt, LaShawn McCoy, and David Johnson. Now, those three I'm also not real big on right now, and mainly it's with LaShawn McCoy, it's a combination of off the field and team around him, and the other two, it's basically just the team around them. I already talked a little bit about Kansas City already. Having what's basically a glorified rookie quarterback. Pat Mahomes drafted last year, but he's now the starting quarterback, and I think that could affect Kareem Hunt because maybe he's a little bit more. Well, he probably will be a lot more turnover prone than Alex Smith was. But maybe they start to get a little more aggressive in the passing game because Mahomes can chuck it deep and do some Brett Favre like things. And then that could hurt Hunt as far as catching passes out of the backfield if maybe the Chiefs go away from that and try to be a little bit aggressive vertically speaking, and certainly they can do that with Mahomes. So those are things that could hurt Hunt a little bit. With David Johnson in Arizona, remember he went down week one. I believe it was it's a wrist injury. It was like a broken wrist or something. I think it was a broken wrist, but he's trying to come back from that. But more than that, there's no more Carson Palmer there. The line continues to be pretty mediocre. So now you got Sam Bradford and Josh Rosen as your quarterbacks. Josh Rosen could end up being a really good quarterback in this league, but he's made of glass. Sam Bradford's obviously made of glass, and he's pretty mediocre. If Bradford does start early in the year and does stay healthy, that will be good for David Johnson because Sam Bradford just loves to check down left and right. So that would be a lot of opportunities for Johnson to kind of make up. If the rushing's down, he can make up for it in the passing game, catch a ton of passes. Josh Rosen's pretty good at checking down too. He played in a West Coast offense all throughout his career at UCLA, but nonetheless, he's a guy who when he has the time, he will get pretty vertical and stretch the field. And again, if the line's kind of hit or miss, that could really affect the running game. So David Johnson, I'd be a little bit wary of taking him in the first round if I can avoid it. And then as far as LaShawn Shady McCoy, all that stuff he was accused of by his estranged girlfriend, as far as like domestic violence and all those claims, it's still like kind of being investigated. I haven't really heard anything much about it lately. So we really don't know what's going to go on. At the NFL, they can randomly suspend guys whenever the hell they want. I mean, we can't understand what the NFL does anymore. So you do have to concern yourself with that availability. He just did turn 30 this offseason, and so you have to worry about, 30 is that magic number from a negative point of view as far as running backs goes. That's when they're kind of over the hill and can't play anymore. Not that guys haven't played well at 30, but you do start to see that decline. So I think because we don't know about some of the off-field stuff, and then as far as the team around him, the line's going to be horrible. Even though I wasn't really that crazy about Tyrod Taylor, at least he didn't turn the ball over, and he checked down a lot to Shady, and they ran it with Shady a lot. But now you're looking at, Josh Allen, who's a rookie, and he's a guy that's a boom or bust player, and he's a big-armed kid, and we don't really know what to expect out of him if he does start week one, which is looking more and more likely. One of the things I talked about last week is A.J. McCarron with that collarbone. Everybody thought it was broken, and that's kind of what I reported when I was doing a training camp injuries story. Well, here it turns out now it looks like he's going to be perfectly fine and right back. But nonetheless, Buffalo is still going to try to go with Josh Allen as their starter. So, regardless, Allen, McCarron, we don't know how good the quarterback position is going to be. And this is a team that, they have a lot of talent on defense, and they've shown a lot of things on defense. But they're also a defense that struggles against the run, and they've kind of shown that a little bit in the preseason already, like against the Browns, for instance. So, this is a team might be playing from behind a lot this year, and so they might be forced to throw it. So those are guys I'm not real crazy about. Guy I love, and You know, I don't know if he'll end up being the number one fantasy guy because he has to get a certain amount of carries and a certain amount of yards to put himself in that conversation. But a guy that I would keep very, very close eye on, he's basically a top 8 or 10 running back, I think, in most fantasy rankings. Alvin Kamara, who had that great rookie year for the Saints last year, obviously he was the offensive rookie of the year, Associated Press offensive rookie of the year. Remember, Mark Ingram's going to be suspended. His fellow backfield mate, Mark Ingram, is going to be suspended the first 4 games of the season because of performance-enhancing drug suspension. The Saints, they have a pretty favorable schedule in those 4 games as well. They play the Falcons, but then I know they play like 3 other teams that aren't particularly good. I know one of them's the Browns, one of them's the Bucks, and there's somebody else too I can't think of off the top of my head that isn't very good. I almost want to say the Bengals, but I don't think it's the Bengals. It's somebody else. But anyways, so they play 3 lousy teams, and then the Falcons, who are a good team. But you look at that. I mean, that's a lot of opportunities for a lot of touches there for Alvin Kamara. So he could really be legitimately the number one fantasy back after 4 weeks. And I expect that to drop off somewhat, especially when Ingram comes back. But if Kamara can somehow get roughly 250 carries on the year, which you figure if he plays all 16. That's a little over 15 a game. 15 a game would be like 240. So if you can get like 240, 250 carries, he averaged 6.1 yards a carry last year. Probably won't replicate that, but if he gets over 5 yards a carry, you're talking about 1,300 yards. He could legitimately catch 70, 80, 100 passes, and then who knows how many yards he'd get out of those. It'd be 800 to 1,000 yards possibly. So he could easily have a 2,000 plus offensive scrimmage yard, season, maybe even 2,200 to 2,500. So I think you really have to look out for him. I mean, he was pretty awesome last year, and I think especially those first 4 games, if he gets a lot of touches like I think he can get, especially playing against some bad teams where maybe the Saints won't try to throw quite as much as they typically do, watch out. So I really like Kamara a lot. And then one other guy I wanted to throw out there real quick is Kerryon Johnson. He's the rookie from the Detroit Lions. They took him in the 2nd round out of Auburn. He's a powerful back. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I want to say he's either 5'11", 6 foot, somewhere in that 230-ish range, 225, 230. But he's a powerful back, but he's also a pretty athletic, pretty versatile back that has pretty decent breakaway speed and is a little bit hard to tackle. Detroit, we saw last year, and we've seen in recent years, they can't run the ball. They get so pass-heavy and pass-dependent. And especially in a lot of the goal line and short yard situations. I mean, just think about that Sunday night game at home against the Steelers last year. There was 2 different drives where they were at the 1 yard line and they got stood up. The Steelers had 2 goal line stands. They couldn't punch it in no matter what the Lions tried to do. I mean, just imagine if Kerryon Johnson was in those situations. You got to remember, Detroit doesn't have a bad line. I mean, they have a lot of talented players on their offensive line. I know they have Ricky Wagner. They have one of the former Iowa guys. I want to say it's Riley Reef, if I'm not mistaken. They have Larry Warford. They've got a lot of talent on their offensive line. It's just the way their philosophy is, the way they do things. They just want to be like a pass-heavy team for some reason. So when they really commit more to running the football, try to gain more balance, assuming they do that this year with Kerryon, Kerryon could have an impressive rookie year. He could be the first 1,000-yard back that Detroit's had in a little while, and he could have 1,300 yards maybe, depending on how much they really do commit to running the ball, which I think Detroit's going to have to do to try to get in the playoffs. Now, it does concern me. You have a Patriots disciple and Matt Patricia as your head coach, and New England's a team that even though they're fairly efficient most years running the ball, they're pretty pass heavy. So you wonder, is Patricia going to bring that over to Detroit when he's already got Jim Bob Cooter and Matt Stafford? Or is he going to try to say, hey, we need more balance, guys? So nonetheless, as far as at least touchdowns-wise, even if the yards isn't as great as it could be, even if he's under 1,000 yards, Kerryon Johnson could still rush for 10-plus touchdowns because of all those short yardage goal line situations that Detroit sometimes gets itself into. So that's something to think about there. Receiver-wise, I know there's a lot of people that are pretty big on DeAndre Hopkins. Great player. One thing I'd be a little concerned about is, you think about Deshaun Watson, a lot of these other guys that come back, these quarterbacks that come back from torn ACLs, sometimes that first year they're a little bit off, so that could affect Hopkins' production a little bit. I'm sure that, the Texans may try to run the ball a little bit more with their running backs because of Watson coming back from the injury. They want to be careful with him. At the same time, maybe they're going to try to have Deshaun not run as much, which would be a benefit to DeAndre Hopkins as far as targets. DeAndre Hopkins is still going to have a heck of a year. Still feel good about him as one of the top 2 or 3 wideouts. Julio Jones, he's kind of having a sort of a contract type dispute in Atlanta, but I do expect him to have a pretty darn good season. I do expect Atlanta's offense to bounce back somewhat this year compared to last year. But the main thing, he only had like 3 touchdowns last year, so that is a little bit of a concern, and the way him and his relationship with the organization right now is a little bit weird, but I think he's still going to be a top 3 guy. But hands down, it's still Antonio Brown. I mean, since 2013, every year he's had at least 101 catches and at least 1,284 yards, and I think at least 8. It's either at least 8 or at least 9 touchdowns every single year. I mean, Ben Roethlisberger, even though he shown a little bit of decline last year, he's still, a top 10 quarterback in this league right now. He's still playing at a high enough level. And then you got to figure, you're going to have Le'Veon Bell again, and then you figure Juju Smith-Schuster. Juju's going to take some pressure off, and he's going to be probably even more productive than last year. I think Antonio Brown, you double cover him, triple cover him, and he's still a guy that can't be stopped. So I would still make him my number 1 receiver in fantasy. And if you happen to have a late first-round pick, let's say you're like in a 12-team league like a lot of people are, if you have a late first-round pick and maybe all the really, really good running backs are off the board, then maybe you would consider taking Antonio Brown in the first round in fantasy. That's probably only a receiver I would take a chance on in the first round in fantasy, by the way. And as far as Juju, he had 58 catches, 917 yards, and I think he had like 7 touchdowns as a rookie last year, 6 or 7. And I think he missed one or two games as well. But I expect him to go over 1,000. The catches should be up. He's looked great in preseason. Touchdowns will probably go up a little bit too, maybe 8 or 10. But obviously, one thing I would say, and this is kind of obvious advice, but try to avoid drafting teammates that play the same position. You really don't want to have Brown and Smith on the same fantasy team, so I would try to avoid something like that. As far as like some surprise guys, I actually think, even though like most people, Joe Flacco's not very good, I think Michael Crabtree coming to Baltimore, I mean, they really need that number 1 type guy. And I wouldn't be shocked if Michael Crabtree bounces back from last year's debacle in Oakland. Got himself in a little trouble in Oakland last year. Team as a whole struggled. His numbers were way, way down, especially compared to the previous year where he had pretty good numbers. But I think he will bounce back, and I think he'll probably have 80-plus catches. I think he'll go over 1,000 yards. And he's a pretty good red zone type guy, so I wouldn't be shocked if he has 9 or 10 touchdown receptions as well. So I think Michael Crabtree could be a nice little sleeper. Obviously, he's not going to be very highly rated and not an early round guy or nothing, but he could be a nice sleeper as a wide receiver 3. Maybe you could take a chance on him as a wide receiver 2, depending on what your draft strategy is and depending on when you go after that second receiver, depending on how many come off the board, how quickly, things like that. But yeah, I think Crabtree, even with Flacco, I think has a chance to have a pretty darn good year. Let me see here. Oh, and then obviously, a few other guys I want to throw out there. Michael Thomas from Saints. He's had 2 big years to start his career. He's kind of like the next Marcus Colston, but probably even better. Obviously, as long as Breeze is around, he's going to keep putting up the big numbers. Kamara, like I said, I think is going to put up some good numbers. But again, there's still plenty of footballs to go around. And, if the Saints do take a step back rushing-wise, that's going to even mean you're going to go bombs away even more in the passing game, like Sean Payton has been known to do in the past. So Michael Thomas should have another 100-plus catch season, 1,300 yards, and probably like 10 touchdowns. So he's a good one. I like the Minnesota duo of Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. Again, don't draft them together, but either one of those guys should be pretty good looking in fantasy, and really even tight end-wise, maybe Kyle Rudolph as well, because I really like the pickup of Kirk Cousins. I think Kirk Cousins could legit have 30 to 35 touchdown passes this year. And so that really bodes well for Diggs and Thielen, both pretty reliable receivers, and Thielen especially showed that last year. So I like those guys a lot too. And another guy that I would throw out there is Jarvis Landry of the Browns. Tyrod Taylor has a good arm, but he just check down, check down, check down, check down all the time. He'll probably be the week one starter. He might start for a few weeks. And obviously you got the rookie in Baker Mayfield, another guy who's a check down type of quarterback for the most part. So that bodes well for Jarvis Landry. Jarvis Landry, 4 years in the league, his career high in any given season for yards per catch is only 12.1. Last year he had 8.8, which is, that's not good at all. And he had like 9.0 a couple years before that. I think he had 10.5 the 1 year. But the scheme in Miami is kind of how they're doing things, and I could kind of see in some ways the same thing in Cleveland. But again, 112 catches last year, just under 1,000 yards, had I think something like 9 touchdowns or something like that. So I think Cleveland, especially, we don't really know about Josh Gordon. Is how good is he going to look, because he's barely played at all the last 3 years, and then you never know if he's going to fail a drug test and all these other things. And Cleveland's depth behind that is decent, but it's not great by any means. So Jarvis Landry, he's been tearing up in training camp so far, and I'd expect a 1,000-yard season, another 100-plus catch season out of him, and probably right around 8 to 10 touchdowns. So I think he's another good-looking player there. A few guys I wanted to throw out real quick as far as a little bit overrated. Let me see, I wrote all these down here. Oh, okay. Demaryius Thomas, Doug Baldwin, and T.Y. Hilton. Demaryius Thomas, I want to say he's like 30 or 31 now. But Denver, once again, the quarterback situation isn't looking great. Case Keenum's already struggled in preseason. He's probably go back to the old Case Keenum he was before last year. There's a talk maybe Chad Kelly could play at some point, but even though he's looked good in preseason, again, former Mr. Irrelevant, second year in the league, we don't really know in an actual regular season situation how good he would be. And Denver has even almost tried to trade Demaryius Thomas already. So, yeah, Demaryius Thomas, I'd be a little bit down on. I think he'll have a little bit of a down year production-wise. Again, getting a little bit older, so I'm not real crazy about him. Doug Baldwin, I've never been really that crazy about him as a player. But my big concern, and Russell Wilson's a pretty highly rated fantasy quarterback, and I'm just going to throw this out there now before I get to the quarterbacks. I would be very, very wary of taking Russell Wilson in fantasy. Russell Wilson has never missed a game since he came in the league in 2012. Extremely durable, but we also know he's a guy that likes to run around a lot. And the thing is, the offensive line in Seattle keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And there's just this feeling out there that this is finally going to be the year. And hopefully it doesn't happen to Russell, but this could very well be the year that, unfortunately, he does get banged up behind that line, and he does suffer some sort of injury that cost him, I don't want to say most of the season, but maybe cost him like a few games, and maybe it's late season games, which, fantasy playoffs, you got to think about that. And then as far as Doug Baldwin goes, yeah, his numbers kind of tend to be all over the place, and if Russell Wilson gets banged up, they've got questionable depth at quarterback right now, so that's really going to hurt Doug Baldwin. Then T.Y. Hilton, a lot of it goes back to Andrew Luck's health. Andrew Luck is back for now, but is he going to be available for 16 games this season? So it's really, really hard to say. I don't know. Most people don't know. So if he goes down for a substantial amount of time again, even though I think Jacoby Brissett is a pretty nice young quarterback, still he's not Luck. So, another guy that I'd kind of stay away from. As far as quarterbacks go, I kind of talked about New England with Gronkowski. Brady is like, I think Rodgers is pretty much a consensus guy, and Brady's kind of like a top 2 or 3 guy. But I would actually kind of stay away from Brady this year, especially, when you think about those first 4 weeks of the season with Julian Edelman being suspended, because Julian Edelman isn't everything. But here's the thing you got to think about. Offensive line, with the Isaiah Wynn injury, offensive line doesn't look so great. Sony Michel, the other first-rounder, got banged up, and he should be back by week 1 or week 2. But who knows what he's going to look like early in the year. So the running game might get off to a slow start. Never knows Gronk's health. Edelman's out 4 games. You trade away Brandon Cooks. You got rid of Danny Amendola. So your receiver depth's not that great. And we've seen New England have some years where they get off to a slow start the first 4 or 5 games of the season, lose a couple games, and then they are pretty much unbeatable the rest of the regular season. So I think Brady, especially the first month of the season, then maybe after that he'll catch fire like he has in the past. But I think despite how good he's looked in the preseason, I would be a little bit wary of drafting him. I think his numbers will take a little bit of a step back. Last year when he won MVP, I want to say he had 32 touchdowns to like 5 or 7 interceptions. Might have even been as low as 4, but I think it was like 5 or 7 interceptions. But anyways, it was a good year. I expect him to be a little bit under 30 touchdown passes. His yards per game might go down a little bit too because I think with the drafting of Michelle, obviously they're going to try to run the ball a little bit more than they have. So I think Brady will still put up decent fantasy numbers, but I don't think he's going to be a top 5 quarterback this year, to be completely honest with you, especially not the first half of the season. So I'd be a little bit wary of him. Rodgers is going to be the number 1 guy. My only concern with Rodgers is, missing half of last year with the injury, and now, he's a guy that's going to be 35 in December. You just wonder it seems hard to fathom that he would get hurt for like a second year in a row, like where he'd miss a bunch of games. But one of the things I mentioned on my article in the sugarhuddle.com is, if you draft certain quarterbacks, it might not be a bad thing to overdraft a backup just to have a good backup plan, pun intended. So I think especially somebody like Rodgers, if you draft somebody as his backup a few rounds later, that might not be a bad thing. And a guy like Alex Smith could be a pretty good backup plan because Alex Smith's not really, for the most part, a legit long-term starter in fantasy. But he's a guy that doesn't turn the ball over much. He's got pretty good weapons in Washington, like he had in Kansas City. Line's pretty good. And they're trying to commit more to running the balls, but still Smith's going to throw it a pretty decent amount, and he still has some pretty good mobility to him. So he might be a good, really good backup option that might not be a bad guy to overdraft a little bit, especially if you have a quarterback that has some durability concerns. And especially, again, with Rodgers, because remember, it's not just his own durability, but you got to think about the team around him. Randall Cobb gets hurt a lot. Devontae Adams has had some concussion problems. And think about the offensive line. He's got a terrific offensive line. The left tackle, David Bakhtiari, is one of the best probably pass blocking tackles in the game. But the problem is he misses a bunch of games. He missed some time last year. Brian Bulaga, I think, only played 5 games last year, and I saw the injury report the other day that it looks like he's kind of questionable for Week 1 against the Bears. Should be back, but it's just. And then even Corey Linsley, the center who played all 16 games last year, I think he only played 9 the year before. So, again, with quarterbacks one hit away, and even with some of these ridiculous rules that the NFL has this season, again, could happen again to Rodgers. You never know. Maybe he doesn't miss 9. I think he ended up missing 9 games, but maybe he misses like 3 or 4 games. And again, that could really kill you in fantasy. So I think having a good backup quarterback for a guy like that is good. If you happen to draft Derek Carr or Marcus Mariota as your starting quarterback in fantasy, those 2 guys you probably want to also consider having a pretty reliable backup in fantasy, because both guys are usually good to miss at least 1 or 2 games a year with some sort of injury. And let's face it, those guys, for as good as they can be, they're also wildly inconsistent. Mariota's numbers last year showed that maybe he's not going to be a starting quarterback in fantasy at all in most leagues. But, again, he's also going to have a pretty innovative offense, kind of similar to like what he had at Oregon. They have Matt LaFleur now as offensive coordinator, who a lot of people are really high on. So maybe there are people in fantasy that will take a chance on him as their starting quarterback. But, again, you're going to probably want to have a reliable backup. And same with Carr, another guy that can be really good but can be wildly inconsistent. So having a good backup who you can kind of start at any point, even when Carr is healthy, might be something good to think about. I'm trying to think if I threw out anybody else. Oh, and then a guy who's like kind of the quote-unquote sexy pick, both in fantasy and just the NFL in general, is Jimmy Garoppolo. Jimmy G, 7-0 so far in his NFL career as a starter. I was 5-0 last year at the end of the season when he got traded to San Francisco. But remember, even though he went 5-0 and he had like 2 or 3 fourth-quarter comebacks and did all these great things, his numbers really weren't that great. He had 7 touchdowns against 5 interceptions. He only averaged like 260 yards a game. So I expect the numbers will be a lot better, and having Kyle Shanahan there helps a lot. And a healthy Pierre Garçon with Marquise Goodwin is good. But then again, Pierre Garçon missed a number of games last year, and he's like 32 now. Tight end depth doesn't look that great, and running back depth they way overpaid for Jerick McKinnon, who really wasn't very good in Minnesota. So when you're thin at running back and you're thin at tight end, and you're even kind of thin at you are pretty thin at receiver, especially if Garcon goes down. Maybe Garoppolo can. I have the Niners, I think, going 8-8 this year, just barely missing the playoffs. And even if they make a run at 8 or 10 wins, still, they might have to kind of grind it out, and there might be a lot of weeks where Jimmy G's numbers aren't the prettiest on his way to some of those wins. And again, wins are wins, but as far as fantasy goes, fantasy implications, maybe his numbers aren't quite as great as we'd like to see him be. So I'd be a little bit careful about drinking the Jimmy Garoppolo Kool-Aid. So I don't know if I'd really want to make him my starting quarterback in fantasy. Now, of course, if you get pretty aggressive with the backs and receivers in the early rounds, like most people will, and you wait maybe a round longer for a quarterback, then maybe Jimmy G's your best option. But I would be buyer beware on him. I didn't talk about kickers in fantasy. I just kickers are pretty self-explanatory. I have nothing against kickers. I think kickers are a lot more important to the NFL than a lot of people give them credit for. But as far as fantasy goes, it's pretty easy to figure out who the good kickers are going to be. So I really didn't bother talking about it in my story on the sugarhuddle.com. And frankly, I mean, I'm not like a full-on fantasy draft website. So me not talking about kickers in fantasy is not, or at least this preview I'm doing is not the end of the world. But Justin Tucker is amazing. So obviously he's going to be high up there. But yeah, I'm not really going to talk much about the kickers. But that's one that you can pretty much figure out yourself. You don't need advice from some random guy on YouTube. But one last thing I just want to throw out real quick before I go is defenses. Usually most fantasy leagues, almost all fantasy leagues, defense and special teams are combined. Two of the highest rated defenses are the Texans and the Chargers. Now, of course, Texans have a lot of talent. They added Tyrann Mathieu. Tyrann Mathieu has injury concerns. J.J. Watt's missed so many games recently, and we just don't know if he's ever going to be right again. They also lost Whitney Merciless last year. This will be like their third defensive coordinator in 3 years. So I'd be pretty gun-shy on them. And if Andrew Luck does play all year and is 100% healthy, now all of a sudden that's two easy games against the Colts, quote-unquote, that are now going to be two difficult games again. So I'm not real crazy about them. And the Chargers, for the same reason, the durability, they lost Jason Verrett already. They have really bad luck with injuries, the Chargers. And, you just never know if one of their other key defensive guys will end up going down. So a lot of reasons to like the Chargers defensively, but again, you just don't know about some of the health there. And also, with their kicking situation not being so great, that's really going to hurt you in fantasy because the defense special teams aspect of it. So that's not really crazy about either defense, but a team I really, really like is the Ravens. Now, their run defense wasn't real great, and that is a concern, but had quite a bit of takeaways. Their secondary is really, really talented. A couple of good-looking linebackers. They got Suggs still. They've got C.J. Mosley, obviously, and they actually ended up having a really good sack total. I think they had like 40 or 42 sacks, somewhere in that range. Pretty decent sack total. So you're going to get pretty good sack production, it looks like. Have some takeaways, some ball hawking guys, maybe a couple defensive touchdowns. And then the other thing to think about, too, again, I just mentioned him, Justin Tucker, pretty much the hands-down number one fantasy kicker. He's so clutch. He's so automatic. So you factor him in to all the things that the Ravens do defensively. I wouldn't be shocked if the Ravens end up with the number one defense in fantasy. So that's probably a defense that I would take. I think I've been kind of referring to this draft guide that my dad got me. This is Pro Football Weekly, which is a pretty decent draft guide. They have like the Falcons, who actually were ranked very, very low in takeaways. I actually did an article on them earlier today for their season preview, and they were ranked pretty low in takeaway. I think they were like 27th in takeaways, really down there in interceptions. Vikings makes a ton of sense. Eagles, obviously, if they're healthy. Rams at 6th. But I do like the Ravens, and even if they're not the number one fantasy defense, I think at 7th they're a little bit underrated, and they could easily be top 3 or 4. So think about that as well. But anyways, at any rate, that's pretty much all I got. So that's just a fantasy football preview for this year. Like I said, I think throughout the season, I'll try to write some articles and talk about fantasy on a weekly basis if I can, and also try to do some videos on that throughout the year as well. But yeah, until then, this is just a fantasy preview I got for you guys. So I hope you enjoyed it, and again, take my advice for what it's worth, I guess. But anyways, go to sugarhuddle.com. I'm Eric Murray. Check out the articles, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and yeah, take care.